All right, welcome to our first online tutorial about Ableton Live. I'm just going to go ahead and share the screen with you. Let's see here. And minimize myself. All right, so here, for the very first time that you open Ableton Live, usually this is what's going to come up, at least in Ableton Live 9, is you're going to get an example song. All I'm doing here is showing me is clicking these little drop down so I can see what's on these tracks. So, so when you first open it up, you'll have this kind of template that you can just play around with. Listen to it. So the very first thing that I will tell you is to start and stop playing is going to be done with your spacebar. So your spacebar is going to play and stop. Otherwise, you have this transport window up here at the very top. And this is always going to be called the transport in any DAW that you work in. This is your play button here. Stop button. So this square is always going to be stop. And then we have our global record button. So, and we'll talk about what the global record does. But play and stop are always going to be part of the transport window. That's what the transport is play, stop, record. And otherwise you can use your spacebar to play and record. All right, so this is just a template, and Ableton has two views that we'll break down. The way that you can see these two different views is by over on the right-hand side, if you can see where my mouse is, you've got these two circles here. We've got one that's showing us a horizontal view, which is highlighted, and that is our arrangement view. This is called the arrangement view, where everything is going linearly from left to right. And then we have the vertical view, which is referred to as session view. So we're going to be using these two views a lot in this course. Ableton, this is what makes Ableton very unique, is that most DAWs that you see and that you work with are always going to be, any other one that I know of is a linear type of view. So you're working always from left to right, which can make it a little bit tricky to be creative, because then you've got to start and stop all the time to play back a certain piece, or then you might have to duplicate things over and over and over again to make long loops that you can then play back while you're coming up with new ideas. The session view in Ableton is what allows us to do that, and this is the looping section. So these are all different loops that you see here. All of these little cells are different versions of this same instrument. So we'll talk about this a little bit more. We'll break it down here. But so I want you to see, you've got two views in Ableton. You've got the arrangement view, and then you've got the session view here. The session view also allows you to have more control over mixing your volume and your panning and things like that. And the quick key to go between these two views, and a key that you're going to be using a lot when you use Ableton, is the tab key. So tab on your keyboard is going to tab back and forth between the session view and the arrangement view. So arrangement view, session view. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to close out this pre-recorded session so that we kind of start from the beginning. I was just showing you the two different views, and if you ever want to pull this template song back up, all you really need to do is go to this help tab up top, up in the toolbar, help view, and it's going to open up this help view over here. And I'll just minimize my screen here. So it's going to open up this help view, and you can actually find some useful tutorials within Ableton Live. But if you want to load that live set, you just come down to this part here where it says, please click here to load the live set. And if you click that button, I'm going to not save this. then what it's going to do is it's going to open up this live set for you, and then you can play with it from there. But I'm going to just do a new live set and show you what it's going to look like from the very beginning. So this is what things are going to look like when you first open up Ableton Live. A lot of the times this help view will be open. If you ever want to close it out, you know, it does kind of take up some space. Then you just can close that out. And if you need it back, if you need that help view back, you can just go to the help menu up on the toolbar and go to help view. And then view, you know, whatever you want to know about live in there. Another little helpful thing about Ableton Live is that if you have this little window open down here on the bottom left-hand corner, right there, and you can close this view by clicking this little drop down. But if you have this open, when you hover your mouse over anything inside of Ableton, it's going to tell you what that thing does. So for instance, I'm on this track 2 basically on-off button for this track. And this is the track activator. Activate this button to hear the track, or deactivate it to mute the track. To see the destination for the track signal, use the output type and output channel choosers available in the mixer's in-out section. So for now, just think of this as an on-off switch if you want to turn a track off or you want to turn it back on. So for the very first time you open up Ableton, after the very first time, excuse me, and when you open up a session, this is going to be the default template that you get, which you can change in the future if you want to. So what we have here by default is 2 MIDI tracks and 2 audio tracks. And each one of these tracks is named. So they can be renamed, and we will rename them. But I want to show you this. So inside of Ableton, I've got these 4 tracks. I've got 1 MIDI, 2 MIDI, 3 audio, 4 audio. If I tab to my arrangement view, you'll see that I have these same 4 tracks. So these are the same tracks. So for right now, I have audio 3 selected. If I tab over to the arrangement view, then you'll see that audio 3 is selected. It's highlighted, you know. So they're correlating from each view. They're the same tracks. Think of the arrangement view as just that. It's where you would arrange your track from left to right, and where you would, you know, put the structure and the dynamics for the song it's all going to take place in the arrangement view. The session view is basically here to create a lot of different ideas of all these different instruments that you have. And then when you have some ideas you like, then you begin to arrange those ideas in the arrangement view. So think about the session view as a looping station. This is where we create a whole bunch of loops and ideas. And then when we find sections of those loops and ideas that we like, then we can just simply take them into the arrangement view by dragging them and dropping them from the session view and arranging our song in the arrangement view. So in the session view, we have what's called a scene. And think of a scene as a row of audio tracks and MIDI tracks that play together. So this area here, this whole row is considered to be scene 1. If we go down a row, this is considered to be scene 2. Everything in this row is a part of scene 2. Everything in this row is a part of scene 3, and so on, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And we can create more of these scenes if if we have a lot of tracks and a lot of ideas. So what the idea here is to do is to put an instrument on a MIDI track. So think of MIDI as a virtual instrument. It's not something that's in the real world that you can actually physically touch, such as a piano, and create sound from it. What MIDI is it's a digital language that represents the idea or the synthesis of analog audio. So you can have a MIDI piano and and use a MIDI controller to trigger and activate that MIDI piano, but it's not necessarily a real piano. And what is neat about Ableton is that it allows us to use our keyboard on our computers as a MIDI controller if we don't have MIDI controllers at our house. I know that this university has 11 of them, so you guys can check them out for 3 or 4 days at a time. And just to make sure that they circulate, you can take them back and check them out again. So a lot of MIDI controllers generally look like pianos. And I have one that I can show to you, but it's but the MIDI controller itself doesn't actually generate any audio. It's just a trigger to generate audio within the computer. All right, so let's continue on with this little tour of Ableton interface. So over on the left-hand side, we have this arrow here, which if we click that, then we get all these categories: sounds, drums, instruments, audio effects, MIDI effects, Max for live, plugins, clips, samples, and then we have packs, user library, current project, add folder. So we have all this, all these other things that we can mess around with over here. So first of all, if we go to instruments, we have, these are all MIDI instruments. So, and we could even go to drums and create maybe, and the drums are also MIDI instruments. So I could drag, let's say this, by the way, you can audition these when you click on them to be able to see how that instrument is going to sound and if it's something that you want to use for your project. And if you press the space bar, it will stop playing. So think of these as all these different drum kits that you can have. And then you have a drum rack, which has no drum sounds in it. And then you can build that drum rack yourself with your own samples. All right, so, and we've got sounds, which are basically just kind of just synthesized different MIDI instruments, I believe. Okay, so let's start with instruments in general. So we've got 2 MIDI tracks, and if you're using a MIDI instrument, then you have to use a MIDI track. You can't put a MIDI instrument on an audio track. Audio tracks are meant for analog audio, so it's something that you would record in real life. MIDI tracks, for the majority of this course, is what we're going to be using. Actually, no, we'll be using quite a few audio tracks as well, because we'll be using samples, which, write this down, a sample is a pre-recorded piece of audio, or MIDI audio, but it's pre-recorded. So we are going to be downloading samples, and we're going to be using samples, and a lot of those are going to be audio samples, so we're going to be using quite a few audio tracks as well. So let's start with a MIDI instrument. Let's start messing around with how this works. So each of these tracks has what's called a device rack. Down on this bottom tab here, or excuse me, this bottom window is called the device rack. So any device that you put on this MIDI track is going to show up down here in this device rack. So let's say, for instance, I put a drum kit on here. I'm going to go to the drum section here. And I'm going to pull in, let's say, this Kit Core 808. I'm just going to simply drag and drop this MIDI instrument onto this MIDI track. And then you'll see that that got loaded onto this device rack down here at the bottom. All right, so get some stuff out of my way here. All right, so we've got this device rack now, and we've got the drum kit here. So if I want to play this drum kit, the only way for me to do that without having a MIDI controller is to use my actual keyboard, because Ableton has set it up in that way for me. The way that you use the MIDI keyboard, the way you use your actual keyboard as a MIDI controller is you have to have this little piano highlighted in yellow. So right now it's off. If it's not highlighted in yellow, I'll just see if I can zoom in on that. you need to have this engaged, have it turned on, and then your keyboard will be a MIDI controller. Now you need to have the track highlighted in order to play anything on it. And let's see here if I can do this. So, all right, so what's happening here is I'm using my keyboard to try and trigger this device, but as you can see, it's not working. I can press the button and you can see this little yellow dot coming up over here, and this is representative of the key that I'm playing on my keyboard. This might get a little confusing, but this is telling me that the keyboard that I'm using is set up an octave higher than where I need to be. So the way that you move up and down octaves, okay, so your keyboard is a little bit limited as far as how many keys it has. It doesn't have as many keys as, say, a piano. So a piano might have 4 different octaves all in the same keyboard, whereas we're dealing with maybe 8 or 10 keys on our computer's keyboard to activate these sounds. So we need to be able to move up and move our keyboard to represent different octaves of a piano, essentially. The way that you move the octaves is using the Z key to move the keyboard down an octave, or the X key to move it up an octave. So I'm pressing the Z key, and as you can see, now I'm a little too far. So I'm gonna press X, and now my A key is the lowest note in the octave that I'm in. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Okay, so just over here on the device itself, you can see this area in which these triggers are going to be activated. This square here is representative of a certain octave on the keyboard, on any keyboard. So if you see that when you press a key and you're outside of that octave range, then if you use the X key or the Y key, it's going to change the octave of the keyboard, so then you can then trigger those MIDI instruments. I hope that makes sense. All right, so we'll get into recording something here pretty soon, in just a minute. All right, so let's just kind of go over what we have here. So we have one MIDI track, and I loaded the kit core drum kit onto it by dragging it and dropping it onto the title. Another way that you can load a MIDI instrument onto a MIDI track, and I'll do it on this one, so I'm just now jumping over to MIDI track 2, is you can also drag and drop that MIDI track onto the device rack itself. So long as this track is highlighted, whatever track you have highlighted is the track that it's going to get put onto. So right now, I have this device highlighted, which means it's selected, and I'm going to press the delete key, and now it's been removed. So let's jump back over to this MIDI track that has this drum kit on it. And when I put that new MIDI track on, or excuse me, when I put this new device onto this new MIDI track then became engaged, record enabled. So if you want to hear, or if you want to activate any MIDI instrument, you need to have that instrument record enabled. So each of these tracks has a record enabled button on it. And so in order to hear it, we need to have that highlighted. And now I can play the drum kit. Now if I switch over to the arrangement view, if I have this track highlighted, then you're going to also still see that same device rack and the same device that's on that track. I jump here down to MIDI 2, you can see that there's nothing on this track. MIDI 3, nothing on this track. So I'm going to go back up to my kit core track. I'll tap back over to my session view. And the session view, think of it as this is where you're going to start generating ideas. But first thing we need to do before we start generating ideas is to set a tempo for our song. So this way, when we're playing, you know, when we're coming up with our ideas, everything is playing in the same time. And the way that we do that is up on the top left-hand side here of your window, you'll see this whole area. This has everything to do with our timing. Right now we're playing in 4/4 timing, which is a very standard, probably the most standard format to play music in. It's 4 beats for 4 measures, or excuse me, 4 beats for 4 bars equals 1 measure. So 4 beats 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. There we have a full measure. All right, so I hope that makes sense. All right, over here we have a number value, 120. This is the number value of beats per minute. This is the BPM, what we call a BPM, beats per minute. And when I press play and stop, you're not going to hear that BPM unless I enable the metronome. So this little button here that has a circle that's empty and a circle that's full enables the metronome. So now if I press play, you're going to hear the metronome. Now to control the metronome volume, which is important, this is going to be on our master channel. So we're always going to have a master channel by default. And a master channel is a track that everything runs through. So every track that you have in your session is going to have a signal flow that sends audio to, and you can see right there on every track here, every audio track is going to send audio to the master track. Yes, we can send our audio to other places, other tracks in Ableton before it goes to the master track, but at one point or another, every piece of audio is going to go through this master track. And that's what the master track is. It has a master volume that you can turn down everything at once all together. And there's quite a bit more that we can do on this master track as well that we will get to in the future. But what I was getting at is that if we want to control the volume of our metronome, it's done with this blue knob here. So this blue knob controls the volume of our metronome. And it also controls, you can see there's another blue headphone down here. When we're sampling and auditioning different sounds, this volume is going to change how loud these samples are being played. So you can see there's a little headphone icon here. There's also one right here. So anything that's relative that is highlighted in blue, this is going to be the volume to hear that back, including the metronome. So I'm just going to press start, and so you can hear that now the metronome is engaged and it's playing 120 beats per minute. By default, this is what Ableton is going to always open up to be 120 beats per minute. You can always change it. You can type in your own value, or you can just click on it and scroll up or down to change the value if you wanted a faster or slower song. Or you can use this tap tempo. So let's say you have an idea in your head. I'm just going to turn the metronome off. What you can do is you can just tap this to that idea or rhythm in your head, or maybe you are inspired by another song and you want to, create something of the same tempo. If you click this tap button, then it will give you the tempo at which you're tapping, and then you can, round it up to the nearest number. So this is pretty neat about Ableton. So let's say I'm going to do I'm going to do something kind of fast. Let's do 130 beats per minute. And then I'm going to enable the metronome. I'm going to press stop. And now if I want to record, so this is where things get kind of fun. If I want to record, and maybe I'll stop here actually, and then I'll come back to make sure that everybody's still on board. So we'll just take a real quick intermission. All right, so I hope you guys are catching on to this a little bit. All right, so I'm going to click back on to this MIDI track that has the drum kit on it. Down here in the device rack, you can see that the device that's loaded on here. And you can actually adjust a lot of these parameters. So you can, you know, this kit has quite a bit on it actually. So let's talk about the device itself a little bit. So each of these devices, meaning each of these instruments that you load on to any of your MIDI tracks, is pre-made of maybe a lot of different components. So if we look down here into this first square that we have that says Kit Core 808, you'll see all these little cells, all these little boxes that have play buttons, mute buttons, and solo buttons. If you see an S, that stands for solo. If you see a B, or excuse me, a B, if you see an M, that stands for mute. All right, so we've got mute and solo. I'll just mention this really quickly. You also have this option on each of your tracks. So if you have a track here, then you have the track's parameters. Every track is going to have this, and this is something that you should know. Every track is going to have an on-off, or basically a mute, an unmute, activate, inactivate button. Every track is also going to have a solo button, where you can solo and just hear that track by itself. It's going to have a record enable button. So if this red button is not enabled, or excuse me, it becomes red when you enable it. But if it's not enabled, then that track is not going to be recorded, anything that you would put onto that track. Another thing that every track is going to have is a volume slider, a volume control, and panning control. So every track is going to have these parameters. So let's just look at that one more time. Every track is always going to have an enable, unenable, basically a mute or unmute, solo, record, volume, and panning. This is going to universal. Every track, every DAW you ever work in is going to have this. Have those standard parameters. All right, so, and if we go into the arrangement view, just to show you quickly, even our tracks in the arrangement view have these. It's displayed a little differently. So if we have our track 1, which is the same track as over here, then we have our active, inactive, solo, record. Now this is our volume. So it doesn't look like a slider anymore in this view, but it does the same exact thing. And then we have our panning. Right now it says C because it's centered. If we went to the left, you know, I believe it goes all the way to 50. We can go 50% left, which is actually 100% left. And then center, and we could also go 50 right, which is basically 100% right. So I'm just going to click C0. So if you click on it and type in 0, then it'll go back to center. So these parameters are going to be on every track ever. MIDI, however, does not show the volume or center because there's no information on it yet, on these blank MIDI tracks yet. So anyway, this one has, since this track has a MIDI device on it, then it gives me those options. So I'm going to tab back over to the session view. All right, I'm just going to close this window a little bit, shrink it down. All right, so now what I was getting at is if you look at this drum kit, each of these little boxes has a sound in it. And let me show you something. What this drum kit is being made up of is a bunch of different samples that are somebody with Ableton built this drum kit and then made it, you know, basically a pre-made template. I'm just going to go over to MIDI track 2 real quick and show you this. So I'm going to load an empty drum rack on it. Like I said, these are all pre-made kits. But if you load just the drum rack itself onto a MIDI track, it's essentially an empty track. And C1 represents the note, so it's going to be the C note on the first octave. So let's see. And my A key right now, if you find the right octave on your keyboard, on your computer's keyboard, then you can activate the C1 is always going to be the A key, and then you can go to the W, which is going to be C sharp, and then the S, which is D, and then the E key, which is D sharp, and so on. And that's how you'll be able to trigger these little pads. Think of them as MIDI pads. So this C1, as you can see, it doesn't have an instrument on it, but I'm triggering it. So it's being triggered by MIDI, but there's no sound on it. So we would need to load our own sounds into this. And Ableton comes preloaded with samples. So if you go over to this left side in the categories tab, and you go down to samples, all of these samples are pre-made audio. And you find something that you like, and there's a lot of third-party samples as well, and we're going to be downloading those as we get a little more into this, because there's some really great samples out there. Ableton has some fine stock samples as well. But all right, so we're going to load a sample into this drum kit. I'm going to drag it and drop it right into that C1 pad, and now my A key will trigger that sample. I'm going to go and I'll say, I'll do this analog stab on my C sharp key, which is my W, and I can trigger both of these sounds now. I can do the same with D1. So you can, build a really cool drum kit, and then you can save it if you like it. So you can play these instruments manually by clicking on the play button, or you can play them with your MIDI, with your keyboard. All right, so let's jump back over to this drum kit that's already been pre-made for us. I just wanted to show you that you can actually make your own drum kits and build them up and design them however you want. And then you can save those. I'll just jump back over here. So I'm going back to drum rack, this empty drum rack that I started to build. And let's say I wanted to save it. What you could do is you could click on this little tab here that looks like a disk. And then you can say, you know, drum rack Cody or whatever. I'm just going to go ahead and delete it because I'm not going to use that. Move to trash. Okay. So just know that you can actually save your drum racks, and then so long as your samples are all online, meaning accessible and in the right location for Ableton to constantly use them, then you'll be pretty set up. That's all right. So let's go back over to this first kit, and this is where we're going to start recording ideas. So I've got this pre-made drum kit. I've got it record enabled, and you'll notice that when I record enable a track, a MIDI track, and let's see if that goes for any track. So when I record enable a track, you'll see that all of these little cells, instead of having squares, they have circles. And that means that they are ready to record. So each one of these little cells in a scene, so remember this is called a scene, this whole row is called a scene. And the idea is that you create ideas that are cohesive with one another per cell, and then you can trigger them to all play at the same time by pressing this play button. So let's come up with some ideas here. I'm just going to press this record button. As soon as I press this record button, the metronome is going to start playing. Audio or MIDI information is going to begin to record in this cell, and I can play for as long as I want. And when I get to a part that I feel like I've completed a full bar, like 1, 2, 3, 4, to the tempo, as long as I have that much, then what I can do is I can select that small amount to just play in a loop. And then I can really start to build some ideas. So let's just come up, I'll just do something really simple here. So I'm going to click it. And now when I did that, you could see that that play button turned red. That means I'm recording within that cell. Now when I press stop, it turns green, meaning it's ready to play back that information for me. So I'm just going to go ahead and highlight this and delete it. And I'm going to press this little record button, and I'm going to start creating a beat to this metronome. And it doesn't matter when I come in. Okay. So I might have gotten a little bit off time there. Not that big of a deal because I can edit all of that information. So let's say, okay, so now I have this little cell, this little clip selected that's in this first cell. And if I want to see the information that's on that, you'll see that we have two windows down at the bottom right-hand corner of the window. Right now we have the device rack selected, so we're able to see what's on our device, what devices that we're using. Over to the left side of that, you'll see the actual track and MIDI information. I'm scrolling down so I can see the information that I actually recorded. So this whole blank area was that full bar that I waited to come in. So it was recording, I wasn't playing anything, so it just has this big blank space. So if I play this, if I come up here and I play this clip back, you'll see that my playhead is moving along until I come in. All of those are the little notes that I played. And then what happened? It started looping again. So think of Ableton's session view as kind of a looping station. What I can do though is up on top of this is called the clip editor. So down here in the clip editor, I'm going to use these brackets to trim down and start playing where I came in. And if I wanted to, you can see that if I zoom in here, and this is how you zoom, by the way, you hover your mouse up on the ruler of the editor, you click and drag down or up, and this is how you're going to zoom in and out on Ableton. Yeah, I don't think there's a quick key for that. There might be in the arrangement view, but if we go to the arrangement view, it's the same thing. You would hover your mouse over the ruler, the time ruler, and then drag up or down, and then you'll see in this upper window which area of the timeline you're viewing. You can also use that timeline to scroll up and down. So this is how you're going to zoom in and out. All right, so back over to this view. So I'm going to, as you can tell, this MIDI note is off time. I'm going to just move it and get it right in time. And then what I can do is I can trim this whole bracket down to play maybe just one or two bars. But because it's the same beat over and over and over again, I don't really need more. In fact, all I really need is one bar if I wanted to play those four notes over and over again. So now when I press play, it's just playing this little loop section. Over and over again. So this is what makes Ableton really cool, is that you can create all of these loops. You don't have to view them as loops, because when you start to put them in an arrangement view, they are not really loops anymore. You come up with various ideas of that loop, and when you start putting all those little pieces of loops together, then you have a structure of a song. So what I could do then is come up with another idea for how I might play this instrument. So as you can see in this first clip that I recorded, I just chose, and I could choose however much I want. It's not going to make any difference because it's the same beat. I could play one bar or two bars or four bars. It doesn't really matter because it really never changed. However, let's come up to this second cell here in our second scene, and I'm going to come up with another idea. So I'm going to press record, and there's no rush to start recording right away because all of that can be trimmed out. And I could mess up a whole bunch of times, and then when I finally get it right, I'll just choose that section. So I'm just going to instead I'm just going to Command Z. So Command Z, keep that in mind. Command Z is always going to be undo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play halftime instead. So I was on the beat every time last time. This time I'm going to go every other beat. So let's see. Okay, that should work. So now I'm going to come down to the clip editor. I'm going to scroll down to where I can see my MIDI notes, my MIDI information. And I actually didn't go every other beat. I went 1, 2, and then off 2. So whatever. I'm just going to trim this bracket again. And one thing to keep in mind is if you have your bracket trimmed, I'm going to zoom really closely in here, and you can see that my kick drum is outside of that bracket. What happens a lot of times is it won't get triggered. So you'll need to make sure everything that you want to be triggered is inside of these brackets. So I really don't need all of that information. It's all pretty much the same. So I'm just going to trim this bracket down. Let's do 4 bars. And as you can see, between these numbers here is a full bar. So between 5 and 6 is a bar. Between 6 and 7 is a bar. 7 and 8 is a bar. 9 and 10 is a bar. So we're going to stick, we're playing in 4/4 time. So I want to work in either ideas in with the rule of 4s. So 2, 4, 8 bars. So I'm going to choose 4 bars, 8 or even 16. But now if I press this play button on this clip, I can turn my metronome off when I'm reviewing things. It's just to keep me on time while I'm playing. And then I can switch between these clips. I can go up and play the first clip. Second clip, and the first clip. And the cool thing about Ableton is that if you come in on the right beat, which normally you would, if everything's, think about this. So if you're playing in 4/4 timing, you usually want to have 4 bars playing. So to complete a full bar. So in this situation, so for this second clip that I recorded, I have 4 full bars recorded. In the first one, I really don't. I have 1 full bar, but because it's the same exact information all the time in that 1 bar, then it's not really a big deal for me to change it to 2 bars. But just to satisfy the real rules here, let's keep it 4 bars. 1, 2, 3, 4. So I have 4 bars of each playing. So what the cool thing about Ableton is that it's always, when you press play, it's always going to come in on the 1. So even if I press it now, I know that sounds kind of funky. I think I have some MIDI clips here, or MIDI information that's getting doubled. So I'm just going to move some of these out of the way. And you can move MIDI information. The cool thing about MIDI is you can move that information around. For instance, I can move this kick drum up here, and now it's the rim shot. You know. And another cool thing about MIDI is you can draw it in. You can double click and start creating beats like this. Obviously that sounds like trash, but the neat thing about it is that you can basically draw MIDI and never even have to play an instrument. So let's get this all lined up. So now when I switch, it's going to come in, it's going to wait, and then come in on that 1. And a lot of these notes could use some refinement as far as the replacement goes. It could always come in on the 1, and there are some shortcuts to that I'll teach you. I just don't want to get too far ahead of everybody right now. I just kind of want to show you how this is working. All right, so think of the session view as a place where you can record that same instrument in a ton of different ways and then find out where it's going to work in the arrangement. So let's go to our second MIDI track. Actually, let's first rename this first track so I know what it is. I'm going to call this, instead of Kit Core 808, I'm going to call this my drum kit. And the way that you rename tracks in Ableton is the Command R button. So Command R is to rename. I'm going to say drums. And then I'm going to press the tab key, and it's going to take me to my next track that I can rename. And I'm going to say piano. And I'm going to press enter because I don't have any audio tracks right now. And in fact, I'm just going to get rid of my audio tracks. I'm going to highlight them and delete them. So I'm only going to work with MIDI today. All right, so now I've got two different ways of playing this kick drum. And this way. Straightforward. And I'm going to press stop. All right, so I'm going to jump over to the piano and let's find a piano sound. So I'm going to go to Instruments, Analog, and let's see if there's a piano. Piano and keys. And all right, I'll just use this organ, and I'm going to drag this organ onto piano track. Oh, and then I need to arm that track. Oh no. Okay, one thing to keep in mind is that you can accidentally overwrite a MIDI instrument. So right now, this drum track has MIDI information on it, as we can see down in the clip editor. What can happen is if I have this drum track highlighted and I double click on another MIDI instrument, what's going to happen is it's going to replace that MIDI instrument with this new MIDI instrument, yet it's still going to play the same MIDI information. So let's see what that sounds like. So I hope this is making sense. So if I come up to this, instead of it being the drum kit, now it's that organ. So you got to be careful not to change the device that you're wanting to use. So let's go back to the drum rack. All right, so I'm going to go over to the piano, and I'm going to put this organ onto the piano. And when I did that, the track then became armed. And I'm using my keyboard to trigger that MIDI information, my computer keyboard. And again, you can move through the octaves. So if I go X, and I'm up a higher octave. If I go Z, and then Z again, I'm down an octave. So I'm going to stay just in this main octave. And I'm going to play this first kit. I didn't record that. Okay, so I need to record this and actually arm the track. So any track that you have highlighted green, so for instance, my drum track over here is, this first track is highlighted green. That's the one that's going to be playing with me. So I'm going to press on this piano. I'm going to press this little record button. Like I said, it's now a circle because the track is armed, ready to record. So I'm going to press record. That's probably plenty. So then I'm going to select on that clip that I just recorded. I'm going to go down to the clip editor, and I can see the notes that I played. I'm just going to trim this clip up and make sure everything stays within the parameters there. And I'm going to shorten this up to either 8 bars or 4 bars. And I'm going to shorten it down up to 4 bars. So I've got between 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, or excuse me, 4 and 5 and 5 and 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4 bars that are going to play. And now what I can do is I can play this whole scene together. Or I can switch and play this rhythm. And then I'll come up with a new piano part real quick. So I'm getting a little off there because of my metronome. So I'm going to just delete that. And I'm going to turn the metronome on. And then I'm going to record. And that's probably enough. And then I'm going to select that clip, come down to my clip editor, and and shorten this up to 4 bars. I'm going to pick maybe the best 4 that I played and move these MIDI notes a little bit. So 1, 2, 3, 4 bars. So I'm going to go to shorten these brackets up, move everything out that doesn't need to be in those brackets, and make sure everything that's in them is on time. And then I can play. I'm going to just so you know, anytime, if you press stop on any of these tracks, so every single track that you have is going to have a stop button right at the bottom. Just in case, because what can happen is you can fill up all these cells for rows and rows and rows and rows and rows of them, and then you won't have any stop buttons. So what Ableton did is it put a stop button, a kind of a global stop button on every track, so anything from that track will stop playing. So I'm going to press stop, and then if you want anything in session view to stop playing it entirely, then you have the master stop button, which this button here is going to stop everything from playing in session view. So right now we're really just talking about session view. We'll move into arrangement view shortly. But I just want you to see the various ways now that we can play with this. So I'm going to click on my straightforward drum track. I'm going to turn off my metronome, and then I'll play one of my piano parts. I could come over now and play scene 2. And it looks like one of my instruments is outside of those brackets, and that's why we didn't hear it. So let's try again. And then I can come up and play scene 1. I need to think about when I'm actually pressing these, because you do have to keep the timing. Anyway, so you kind of get the idea. So the idea here in session view is to create a bunch of different loops with the same instrument, and then we can kind of mix up how they're playing along with each other. So you can come up with a lot of different drum ideas, and I was being very basic, only using one kick drum, but you can go in there and really start to craft this piece if you come down into the clip editor, and let's see where there's a hi-hat. So maybe I want to create some hi-hat. And all I did was I looked over to the left here, and I saw what each of these rows in the clip editor is, because this is all relative to that drum kit. Then what I can do is I can start drawing in a bunch of, a bunch of MIDI information. And what you can do is you can copy all this. So if you highlight all those little hi-hat hits that I just did, I highlighted them all. I'm going to press and hold the Option key. And just like in most other programs, on Macs, if you click and drag, then you'll duplicate. So what I'm getting at here, though, is, and we can talk more about this, but you can essentially be really fast at creating beats. I'm just going to highlight all of these now. I'm going to click Option, click and drag, and now I've done that really fast. So let's now hear that. Maybe we can add a snare drum in. So you can, if I come down to the clip editor down here, you'll see there's the snare drum. This row here is the representative of the snare drum. So maybe I go. And this is how we start to create dynamics. So then what we can do is once we start coming up with all these ideas over in the session view, then we start bringing them over into the arrangement view and arranging them. So I think this is going to sum up the lesson. It's probably fairly substantial size lesson, but I wanted you guys to really get familiar with this. So please write down any questions that you have, and think about like session view as this place where we're just coming up with ideas. We can play for as long as we want. We can keep loops running and running and running and until we come up with something. And then it's really, you know, it can be really easy to come up with a lot of really good ideas you would have never had. And then, you know, when you want to put it into more of a song structure, then we take it to the arrangement view and start arranging everything. And you can absolutely do a lot of creating inside of the arrangement view as well. You know, once a song is there, and once you kind of have an idea of the structure, then you start adding vocals and things like that, and that's when you'll probably end up doing a lot of recording in the arrangement view as well as the session view. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you guys have a better understanding of how Ableton works. And I know this was probably kind of a lot of information for an introduction, but I really want to get you guys making music as soon as possible, rather than, you know, dragging this out. Here's the interface, and then you still don't know how to make music. So you don't need to be a musician by any means to work with Ableton. You can really just feel things out, and so long as you're sticking to the rules, like my suggestion would be stick to the most standard rules of using like 4/4 timing, 1, 2, 3, 4, very straightforward, and just when you're creating your loops, so long as you have 4 good bars or even 2 good bars, then I would say stick with 4 if you can, but if you can only get 2 that are, then basically what you would end up doing is just duplicating those 2 bars, and then you have 4 bars. Then you can really start building some really neat stuff. All right, everybody, so we'll be meeting at 1 p.m. and we're going to have a discussion about this lesson, and we're going to clear up any questions that you might have. All right. All right, so you want to, when you save your projects, you'll want to go to the File tab and click Save Live Set. Now, my suggestion is that you save them all in one place. So for instance, for me, in my music folder, I have you know, my music, and then I have Ableton sessions, and I'll just create a new folder, and I'm going to call this one Digital Music Production Spring 2020, and I'll call this Lesson 1. Click Save. Now, when we begin to implement more and more files into this project, then we'll start creating folders within that project to stay organized, and so that our folders, so that our session stays together. And it's the same rules if you've taken any of my classes in the past. I'm a stickler about organization, so everything in this project needs to stay with this project. And Ableton gives us some creative ways of doing that in case we're pulling information or samples from other resources. So we'll get more into that, but I just wanted to show you how to save your sessions. Tomorrow for our lesson, we're going to go into start setting up all of our preferences so that we're getting the highest quality that we can out of these lessons. All right, that's it. I'll stop with that.